Welcome to the Healer's Choice. We continue our story. The Bell of Truth. It was late the next day. Eirina left the Sleepless Moon in a gray velvet cloak. Her eyes darted left and right as she walked over the drunken scrawl of liquor between cobblestones. There were people passed out along the edges of the taverns and posted at the walls of alleys. She didn't recognize any of them until her eyes found Faltho on the steps of an inn called the Crooked Finger. She breathed out a sigh of relief, knowing at least he would not be present at the gates to the Pearl. At high sun, she neared the gates to the plaza. There were droves of people pulling in from all directions of the main thoroughfare. She trailed into the throng of people, trying to match the elegant pace of the other ladies beside her. The closer she approached the gates, the less she could hear the excited, fevered conversations around her. Her heart beating loudly into her ears as she closed the gap to the first of the guardsmen, Julius. Eirina nearly stopped at the center of the gate, panic making her body stiffen as she watched Julius closely. However, he paid her little attention, and the people behind her stopped, shifting around, angrily glaring towards her as they made their way into the plaza. Looking over the crowds of hundreds milling about, Eirina's palms began to sweat. She started her steps once more. Her feet shook with every pronounced step, until she hesitated at the edge of the gate. Instinctively looking back toward the guards, Eirina was then shoved forward by several men who weren't paying much attention. The sounds of the Pearl and those around her came back to her swiftly as her feet stumbled from being pushed. She went wide-eyed and from within her hood shifted her head to look around. She let the foot traffic carry her forward so as not to get jostled again, allowing the torrent of bodies to push her this direction and that direction, before she gathered her courage to make her way toward the bakery. The air and atmosphere of the Pearl were no different than the Glades or the Drift Market. It was just another district like all others. Though there were many people and none seemed to react to her presence, it was all the same. She received a few odd stares as she struggled to break through the pattern of movement to reach the bakery. Once at the edge of the pâtissier, she pulled back her hood, her long brown hair cascading in tight curls. Her face, though still tired at the eyes, was clear of grime, and thanks to Dia's insisting, Eirina even had makeup on. Eirina took in a breath, and her stomach churned so loudly that she looked at everyone as though they were able to hear it. The bakery was in full swing, and the smell was powerful, now more so that she was so close than before. She untied her cloak, hanging it over her arm and placing her coin purse at her side. She felt her face flush when she stood up straight, seeing eyes on her filled with curiosity. No longer experiencing passing glances, Eirina's ears turned bright red. She took another breath, closing her eyes. Behind her darkened eyelids, the sunlight created red dancing lights that swirled in an unrecognizable pattern. Upon opening them, her lips peeled apart, allowing her to let loose a gentle sound. At first it was a whisper. Then it grew and grew. Her voice carried over the masses as everyone that had been walking stopped to listen. There was no one she recognized in the crowd, no familiar scowls of confusion, just awe and adoration. Her face was pink and lively. Her voice rang out, reverberating off the pale walls of the plaza. Once her song reached its end, she held her note. The hair on her arms stood as sound emptied from her chest. She then went down into a gentle whisper, pulling the crowd closer. She closed with a bright smile, bowing her head. She heard nothing. Not a whisper. No movement. She refocused on the faces around her. She had stricken the entire plaza silent. Then several people began to step forward, clapping. Then more applause. And then a roar of voices broke out as people clamored to line her purse with coin. And not copper, silver. She even saw the glint of a few gold fall. Her heart beat like a drum, her fingers shaking as she bore a grand smile. Eirina took a bow and politely waited for people to begin dispersing, but to her surprise, many of them clung to her space with glittering smiles. Young men with curious eyes and fine suits were approaching her, asking her to lunch or for her name. They were polite, hands staying within their own space, something Eirina was completely unused to.
You certainly are quite the surprise. We are so used to having the lowly girls sing. But your talent surpasses her.
Eirina seemed to bristle at the comment, but quickly tamped down her reaction.
I doubt that there's much difference in our talents, good sir. You see, I'm...
Another of the men smiled widely at Eirina, cutting into her words.
That accent. Are you a student from the Glades?
She certainly doesn't have the look of a young student. Perhaps a tutor.
She should entertain at the Duke's ball.
The Duke would only hoard her to himself. A voice like that ought to sing for the king.
She took up her belongings, trying her best to seem comfortable with the attention that was tearing at her.
I likely wouldn't be welcomed in such high houses.
She took a step, and immediately the forced smile she had put on her lips vanished at the sight of Julius making his way through the crowd. Her high note had reached the guards, and Julius in particular seemed determined to find the source. She took up her things, ready to flee, but there were so many people trying to talk to her that she couldn't get by.
Eirina!
She felt her heart flutter in panic, and her legs stiffen as the guard finally pressed in toward her. He looked her up and down, his face filled with disbelief. Then the soft features of the usually aloof guard turned sour, before he turned to the crowd, putting his hands out toward them.
You crowd the lady too much. Clear a path. Can't you see how nervous she has become?
The crowd looked at Eirina apologetically. They also seemed intrigued as to how the guard seemed so familiar with this new face. Once he had enough room around them, he took Eirina's arm. She nearly jumped back, but he settled a rough grip on her elbow.
Follow, or I will reveal you as the fraud you are.
Eirina's face paled as she let her arm stiffly rest along Julius's. He took her through the crowd with a smile, leading her toward the gatehouse. Eirina did her best not to let her head hang, but there were tears of horror brimming on the edges of her eyes.
So, you were up to this last night, were you? Scheming on how to better your hand?
Eirina said nothing.
It is a brilliant plan. None of these pedigreed spoon lickers have even bothered to remember your face, much less what you sound like.
Julius looked over her panicked face as they stood inside the stables of the gatehouse.
I could even help.
Eirina's entire body tensed and Julius gripped her arm tighter.
I'll keep your secret. Even make sure Falther lays off. You could be rich in a matter of months.
He swung her by her arm and Eirina's back hit a pillar.
You just have to do me a few favors in kind for my silence.
Eirina tensed in Julius's grip, the sweet tones of his voice now gone as the bitter nature she knew had been there surfaced fully. As Julius's eyes shifted over her, Eirina's own fear-filled eyes began to narrow with disgust.
I won't wait for an answer.
He squeezed Eirina's face, much as she'd seen Faltho do to the working girls in Ruby Town. However, before he could move in, Eirina threw her arm up, her full coin purse smacking him with the full weight of 3 pounds of silver and gold. Julius growled out, his grip loosening on Eirina, who immediately made for the stable exit. Julius went after her, shouting,
Catch that burrow trash!
Eirina could see people turning to face the commotion. She paid little attention until the second guard came toward her, blocking her escape from the plaza. She clutched the coin purse in her arms with desperation, looking at the people around her, but no one stepped forward. They all had zeroed in on Julius's shouts.
Grab that fraud!
Eirina's head spun as she shifted, trying to dodge away from the second incoming guard by using the crowd, but they all backed away from the scene, keeping her exposed. She spun in a panic, trying to find a way to flee, but as soon as she felt a hand rest on her, she closed her eyes and swung her arm to strike. The crowd gave a collective gasp into silence. Eirina felt a gentle grasp on her arm that had stopped her strike. She peeled open her eyes and saw an icy stare directed down at her. An elven man, not half, but a full-blooded elf dressed in a fine uniform similar to the guards. However, his uniform was more opulent and well-maintained, decorated with a capelet. He released her arm, his icy eyes softening as he continued to stare down at her. Julius, having caught up to Eirina, went wide-eyed at the presence in front of her.
Ah, Commander Ryej, sir.
And Julius stepped in, taking several confident steps forward, taking hold of Eirina's arm, which held her hefty purse.
Thank you for holding her, sir. I can escort this fraud from the plaza immediately.
At the mention of the fraud, many of the crowding people pulled back from Eirina even further. That's when faces became familiar. The men that had so complimented her and the women that looked with envy, the same faces that had shown such disgust and shock when she had been dressed in rags. Julius tugged on Eirina hard, pulling her from Ryej's space as he began forcing her towards the gate. Eirina, frightened, began to shout at the top of her lungs.
Is wearing a nice dress such a crime? I've done nothing wrong.
Julius jerked her arm hard, trying to deter her from speaking.
Tell me, what law restricts the low from truly entering this place in search of good and honest work?
Julius then jutted his chin to the other guard. They nearly stepped in to help get control of Eirina, but a shining long sword carved through the air to cut off his advance. Julius stopped pulling, looking to Eirina's left. Eirina looked to her side and saw the commander standing there, his eyes darkened with malice.
There is no such law.
A procession of armed men passed through the crowd standing at Ryej's back. Eirina looked back at Julius, who looked pale and surprised, but there was a flash of anger in his eyes as he stared back at his commander.
Now, if you would,
he gestured to Julius with his blade.
Release the woman, and if she has a bruise upon her, then you will have 20 in recompense.
Eirina's face winced as she felt Julius's grip on her arm tighten for a moment before he released her. Ryej made a low bow to Eirina, which prompted everyone around him to bow, even Julius and the other guards. Eirina was wide-eyed. Eirina's knees shook, and she closed her eyes, giving a weak curtsy as Ryej stood back up.
I recognize you from your earlier performances. Miss Eirina, is it?
He held his hand out to her. Eirina looked to the utter confusion in everyone's eyes, and then, with a trembling hand, took Ryej's palm in hers. He bent down to give a polite peck.
I am Ryej Vee-Dara, commander of the Grand Duke's army and head of disciplinary affairs to Aethiniel's guardsmen.
As he stood to his full length, Eirina was nearly forced to look up at him due to his towering height.
I apologize for not stepping in earlier. Are you injured?
Eirina shook her head as Ryej's cool stare trailed to her arms.
I am glad for it.
He rounded on Julius.
Guardsmen, return to the barracks. We'll be discussing your behavior at length when I return.
Julius stiffened, his eyes darting to the other guard, who just took a step back from him, keeping clear how far he wanted to be involved in the situation. Julius grimaced and then nodded before starting out of the plaza. Ryej then looked back toward Eirina.
Allow me to escort you home.
No, I'll be quite fine.
The burrow is a dangerous place, and with a purse that full, you're going to make yourself an easy target.
Eirina looked at the purse she was cradling with a white-knuckled grip. She looked around to see Julius's back as he walked away, and the stern and callous glares from the other people that had once been staring at her in such awe. Eirina closed her eyes tightly, her jaw tensing.
Just as far as the burrow's edge.
Ryej raised a brow, giving her a simple nod. He gestured for his men to disperse the crowd around them, and in one swift motion, he removed his cloak from his shoulder, putting it over her. When the weight of it had dropped onto her shoulders, she looked around, Dia's cloak having been lost in the confusion and fear of Julius's approach. Eirina's throat bobbed, her pulse quickening as she looked down at the cobbles. Ryej put a finger to her chin, forcing her head to look up.
Head high.
Eirina looked at the crowd as they passed, the eyes of judgment on her before she looked at Ryej's face. Calm, expressionless, elegant.
You have done no wrong. Focus on your path ahead, and their stares will fade.
Looking ahead, her sights set on the gate and not those around her. Eirina's face was still tense, but there was no fear, no embarrassment. When they reached the gate, Ryej turned to his entourage that had regathered behind them.
Dismiss the other guard and take over the watch here.
He glanced toward Eirina and then his men, likely signifying his need not to say more. His men bowed their heads and made their way back into the plaza. The moment she was outside the gates, Eirina's tense shoulders fell.
Thank you for stepping in as you did.
It is my duty that abuses such as this are stopped. Besides,
His eyes looked at Eirina's powder blue dress.
I don't think the owner of that dress would have forgiven me if I'd let anything happen to you.
Eirina held a look of shock.
You know?
She didn't say Dia's name, but instead held it back in case he was mistaken. Ryej's eyes were gentle as he looked ahead while they walked.
The moon never rests, and she is marked as the best in her trade.
Ryej's clear reference to Dia's words made Eirina go wide-eyed. He gestured ahead of them.
It was right there.
He was pointing to a curve in the thoroughfare where a garden sat with several benches and new spring saplings.
That's where I first met her.
He then looked at Eirina again.
And that was the first dress I bought her.
Eirina looked down at the powder blue gown and gawked at it speechlessly. Ryej's gentleness reached his voice as he continued to speak.
She always told me about a family she wanted to see again, though I don't imagine you were thrilled at her situation.
Her situation is surely not ideal. But she's alive, and that's more than I could ever ask for.
Ryej looked from the top of Eirina's head to the walk ahead.
She thought you'd never go see her. I'm glad she was wrong.
Eirina's eyes glanced up at Ryej's gently neutral face.
What is she? To you?
Ryej just shrugged, his expression tightening.
Not my place to disclose such things. You may ask her yourself, though I suppose she'll give you an equally vexing answer.
Eirina nearly stammered in confusion as he began taking pace in front of her.
Let us get you back before the sun passes any lower.
She gathered up her senses and followed Ryej toward the steel district, then to the edge of the stone burrows. Hi everyone, this is your tavern keeper, Vonnie Vee-Dara. I just want to thank you for listening to episode 3 of The Bell of Truth. Now there are 2 more episodes in Act 1, however we will be taking a short break in order to fill in for Act 2. Also, announcement time, we will be having a secondary story project coming up soon, and it's a little bit of an experimental piece. However, the story itself is dear to me and my husband. We had been working on it for 4 years. I had finished it several years ago, but haven't found a platform in order to tell the story, and I thought, why not start it here? Thank you for listening to the Tavern announcements, and I'll see you here next time for our stories.